On today's episode, we're going beyond the monster manual and taking a look at Volo's Guide to Monsters.
Hey nerds, I'm Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes. On today's episode, we've got our copies of Volo's Guide to Monsters, and we're going to show you what's in the book. This is a pretty awesome and really diverse hardcover expansion for the D&D rules, because it has lots of great ideas for dungeon masters in it, new playable races, as well as an awesome bestiary of brand new monsters for dungeon masters to inflict upon player characters.
Yeah, and you can pick it up at your local game store for about $50, which isn't too bad. And it also comes in two different covers. The standard cover, which is the one that I have here.
And this is the limited edition cover with cover art of a Mind Flayer by Hydro74.
Which is one of my favorite monsters ever.
Yeah, although I really like the classic cover for Volo's Guide to Monsters. It's a really awesome piece of artwork of
Great
a
giant
frost
there.
giant. Yeah. So there's three main chapters in Volo's Guide to Monsters, and we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about each chapter. The first chapter is all about monster lore. The second chapter introduces some new playable races, and the third chapter and appendixes have statistics for a huge range of brand new monsters to use in your game.
So, why don't we dig in? So, the first chapter that you're going to find in Volo's Guide to Monsters is Chapter 1, Monster Lore, which has a whole bunch of different sections for some of the most classic and most awesome monsters in D&D.
Yeah, I really like this section. It doesn't reinvent the wheel on any of the classics, but instead it kind of dives right in and gives you lots of ideas on how to really flesh out and realize classic D&D monsters like orcs, kobolds, and hobgoblins and goblins, but it even has a couple deep cuts in there as well.
It has some that really stood out to me, two monsters in particular. Their sections really stand out to me. One of the first sections is about beholders, which are probably one of the most memorable and classic monsters. They're on the covers of a lot of the books.
They're certainly an iconic creature.
Yeah.
And they're really diverse as well. And Volo's Guide to Monsters really talks about all the different shapes beholders can take. There's a bunch of tables inside that help you randomly generate like what the eye stalks and mouth of a beholder look like, what color it is it covered in scales or bumps. So these are the types of ideas that each chapter in the first section kind of give you. Kind of these little interesting details and ideas of like how to take that monster and describe it in really rich and full detail.
Not only that, but the sections also include a lot of maps and things that you can use to really flesh out your beholder's lair, or several of the other monsters have their own lairs. And as a DM, it really helps to know what their lairs look like, what they feel like, what are your players going to experience coming into these places.
It also gives you a lot of great advice for role-playing these various monsters, what their bonds or ideals might be, even giving you suggestions about what kind of minions that they can include. And that's what makes Volo's Guide to Monsters really useful for a dungeon master that's going to be homebrewing their own campaign, but isn't necessarily ready to invent things whole cloth, right? If you don't want to make up your own monsters, but you want to use the classic monsters in Dungeons & Dragons, there's enough material in like 2 pages of this book to keep your campaign running for months on end.
My other favorite section in the first chapter is the Mind Flayers, which is on the cover of the special edition one here. And the Mind Flayers have a beautiful section which includes stats for the Elder Brain.
Yes, and talking about how the whole Mind Flayer society works, from how they kidnap people to transform them into Mind Flayers, and what can happen if that transformation goes wrong. There's some fantastic artwork as well in this section, including an Elder Brain and an autopsy of a Mind Flayer. It's a fantastic piece of artwork. So the first section, again, covers everything from beholders to UNT, fitting in a couple staples like gnolls, orcs, goblins, and more, and really peppering that with lots of great artwork, ideas, and maps. No dragons, though.
No dragons.
Kobolds, but no dragons. I think they're probably saving that for its own book.
We can hope.
Let's move on to the next section. So, Chapter 2 of Volo's Guide to Monsters is all about new character races for your players to choose from. Yeah. These are a little bit more different than the standard fare in the player's handbook, though.
Yeah, depending on the type of campaign you're running, you want to be careful with, looking at these guys. They're very exotic creatures that you can have your players choose.
Yeah, there's about a dozen new player races, although only about half of those are covered in a lot of detail. These are the Azamar, the Fearbogs, Goliaths, Kenku, Lizardfolk, Tabaxi, and Tritons. But there's also statistics in here for playable orcs, goblins, kobolds, and other races that are covered in the prior chapters as well.
Yeah. So, one thing to note is, depending on the type of campaign you're running, you may want to ground your campaign more in reality. I know, Monty, you're a big fan of having a much more standard fantasy setting for your character races.
Yeah, I really like my players to be humans, half-elves, and the more mundane things. So for me, I have a lot of difficulty with Volo's Guide to Monsters. The racers in here are quite exotic. Some people don't like Tabaxi because they're really not into cat people. The lizard folk can be really tough because they're a very alien species in their psychology. And not everybody wants to have half-angels in the form of the Azamar in their campaigns. That said, some of these races are really, really awesome, and they have lots of great role-playing opportunities. Yeah. And they've been increasingly integrated into the D&D campaign books that have been coming out, with lots of great opportunities for races like Tabaxi and Lizardfolk in campaigns like Tomb of Annihilation.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Do you have any favorites of the monsters in here?
This sounds ridiculous, and I know that we've had many conversations, but my absolute favorite race showed in here is the Goblin. Why? Because I think goblins are hilarious. I love role-playing them as a DM, and the idea of getting to play a player character that's playing this like ridiculous kind of feral little monster is hilarious to me, and I actually have had a lot of fun coming up with some goblin characters. Do you have a favorite?
I really have always liked Azamar, and I like how they portray Azamar in Volo's Guide to Monsters as having a lot of conflicts, even though they're an angelic race, but you can play a fallen Azamar. Azamar are one of those player character races that over the various years of D&D, they've really changed their identity a lot alongside tieflings. Mm-hmm. So I think a lot of people will like the fact that there's tieflings and Azamar now fully supported in the rules together. And I think that there's an interesting like light versus darkness campaign that you could run with Azamar and tieflings in your party, and I'd be really interested in that. I also really think that the Goliaths are a huge favorite of mine, and I gotta say, I am warming up a little bit more to the Tabaxi, but I think that's because our friend that's playing one in our campaign right now is doing such a good job of role-playing one.
Yeah, he really captures the qualities of being a human-like creature, but also a cat, to very hilarious degrees.
Yeah. My only piece of advice is that if you really have your heart set on playing one of the races in Volo's Guide to Monsters, do ask your Dungeon Master for permission. Think about how they might fit into that Dungeon Master's world and really work with them, because there are going to be some DMs out there that are going to react to these races because they're so monstrous. On the flip side, my advice to DMs is really have an open mind with these races. You might be surprised at how interesting they can be. For myself, I was not considering having Tabaxi in my campaign setting at all until a player wanted to play one. And I found a really cool niche for them to occupy in my campaign world that's created a really cool storyline. It's not a spotlight storyline, but a really interesting tidbit on its
subtext.
Yeah, exactly.
I also know that we had a discussion at first when I said I wanted to play a goblin in one of your one-off games. You were like, why would you play a goblin? They're evil creatures. And we worked together to come up with a plot where I was a goblin kidnapped by wizards and experimented on to try to make me a more intelligent goblin and a more human goblin. And now I basically kind of stole some bits and pieces from some of my favorite comic book characters and made it into a goblin who was trying to find his purpose in the world.
And being like a random magical experiment is always a great way to play a more monstrous player character in a standard campaign where you might be just trying to be a hero. Or where such characters or monsters just don't normally exist in your campaign world. So consider that as an option for using the resources in Volo's Guide to Monsters.
So, Chapter 3 takes us to the Bestiary, which is a list of all of the awesome other creatures that you can run.
Did you know that there's a really cool artwork Easter egg in Volo's Guide to Monsters between the Bestiary and Chapter 1? If you look at the artwork at the beginning of Chapter 1 are the adventurers on one side of a door, and the artwork on Chapter 3 are the monsters waiting for them on the other side of that door.
I never noticed this. This is incredible.
It's really cool, eh?
Yeah.
Yeah. But in any case, by Chapter 3, we've got all the new monster stat blocks for, I think, almost 100 new creatures to use in your D&D campaigns. Some of these creatures are extra stat blocks and versions of monsters that are covered in the monster lore chapter. So as an example of this is where you find the stats for the Elder Brain, or the Ultraloth, or the other variants of different mind flayers and beholders that you can use in your campaigns.
I know that one thing that we had talked about is the fact that these creatures actually stand out a little more than the ones in the monster manual.
I agree.
And it's because a lot of the creatures in Volo's Guide to Monsters actually have a lot of really neat abilities and actions that they can take on their turn that make them more than just a bag of hit points that smashes the party.
And some of them are even unexpected variants on monsters that your players think, oh, that's nothing to worry about. One of my favorites is the Spawn of Cuss, which is a completely classic D&D monster that's been brought back for 5th edition. And outwardly, the Spawn of Cuss looks like a zombie until you realize that it's regenerating from all of its wounds, and it's covered inside with hundreds of hideous green worms that the zombie actually flings at you that then try to burrow into your skin and transform you into a zombie.
So you want to mess with your party, make them think they're about to fight zombies, and then fling green worms at them.
Terrifying campaign.
That's what I do on my weekends. So, some of my favorite creatures in here, I actually ran a swamp setting a few weeks after I got this book, and I decided to spice things up a bit. And I included Banderhobs, and I also included the Froghemoth.
Yes, the Froghemoth.
He is a giant frog with tentacles that is just brutal to fight, and he was so much fun.
I gotta say, I really want them to do a miniature of the Froghemoth.
I'm waiting for one.
Yeah, it's gonna be super, super exciting. One other really useful expansion that's in the appendix section of Volo's Guide to Monsters are more non-player character stat blocks. These expand on the NPC stats that are found in the back of the monster manual, but actually include a lot more diverse stats, like stats for a blackguard, or stats for a legendary warlord that has legendary actions, as well as a stat block for a spellcaster specialized in each school of magic. So awesome. I really, really like those, and I really highly recommend using them because they offer a little bit more diversity than the NPCs that are just found in the basic monster manual, and I find myself coming back to these NPCs in Volo's Guide to Monsters over and over again because they really do make for much more interesting combat encounters than a lot of the monsters in the base monster manual. Volo's Guide, I think, for me, is kind of like that extra spice. It's really the icing on the cake of the core of the monster manual. I really think that you need to own the monster manual to fully utilize Volo's Guide to Monsters. It takes those monsters like giants and orcs that are really just a bag of hit points with an axe and makes them really interesting and really, really creative. And then it doubles down on that by adding all of these amazing and zany creatures to the book.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think if I was going to recommend it, I would say once you've got the core rule books, make Volo's Guide to Monsters your next D&D book.
It needs to be an amazing addition at your table as a DM, and it complements the monster manual extremely well.
Yeah, and with just a touch of new options for your players, it's a really great buy for your entire table. I wouldn't necessarily recommend a player running out and grabbing Volo's Guide to Monsters In part because there's very little aside from the player statistics for the new creatures that you're going to use, and you're only going to need those when you're creating your character at the start of the campaign. So having one copy of Volo's Guide to Monsters at your table is really, really useful, but this isn't like the player's handbook where you're going to want everybody to go out and get a copy.
So if you already own the monster manual, but you're looking a way to spice up your encounters as a DM, the Volo's Guide to Monsters has a whole bunch of things that will inspire you and a bunch of tools that you can just add into your encounters.
It's got some great new playable races for your characters. As well, the Monster Lore chapter is an endless source of inspiration, and I gotta say, it's a great read in its own right. The book alone is worth it just for reading that Monster Lore chapter and enjoying all the amazing artwork inside. If you read Volo's Guide to Monsters and are inspired and want to use the creatures in it, but aren't quite ready to write your own campaign, you might want to check out Tomb of Annihilation because it uses a lot of the monsters that are in Volo's Guide to Monsters. You can find our video review of that module right up over here.
And if you're looking for some things to get started, rather than just going out and buying Volo's Guide, you may want to check out our Player's Handbook versus Starter Set over here.
You can pick up any of these products by following the links right down below.
Please subscribe so you never miss an episode.
And we'll see you next time
in the dungeon.